Okay, let's get started. Welcome everybody to our fourth 78 Connect. We're really excited about how this program has been going. Oh, and this is so tacky, but before we start, a quick plug for the class notes, please. They're due at the beginning of the week, and since I double as your class secretary, help a girl out, please. Okay, so the format for tonight will be as they were before. I'm going to introduce our three panelists, and then I'm going to ask them each a series of questions, and then we're going to break it up for Q&A from you guys. The audience will be on mute during their presentation, and then if you want to ask questions, you have two ways of doing it. You can raise your Zoom hand. Not that I'm entirely sure how to do this, but I'm sure you're all good with that. You can also type in your questions into the chat room. This is being recorded by Williams College, so just know that anything that you ask will be part of that recording. Yeah, I think that's all the business. John Pharmacus is helping me out tonight with the mechanics, so if anything goes wrong, what can I say? John's going to have me covered. So tonight we are discussing the Great Migration and maintaining roots. That's the full title. And as I wrote in the invitation, the Great Migration refers to a period in US history, which went from about 1916 to say 1970, in which about roughly 6 million Black people left the South and traveled to urban areas in the East, in the Midwest, in the Northeast, and also the West. So, and there were, some basic reasons for this. Obviously, Jim Crow became more and more codified, and also poor economic conditions. And if you want to learn more about this, I pitched this in the invite too, but I really recommend Isabel Wilkerson's book, The Warmth of Other Suns, where she really describes this entire period of our history. And I'm going to read you a quote from that book, which is, "What binds these stories together was the back against the wall, reluctant yet hopeful search for something better, any place but where they were. They did what human beings looking for freedom throughout history have often done. They left." But it's actually a little more complicated than that. And in her book, she profiles, I think, 4 people. And we're lucky enough to have classmates who are going to share their own family story. And how, this is such a great opportunity for us to have this sort of firsthand view of history. So thank you to all 3 of you, who I will now introduce. Charles Sanders is a graduate of Georgetown Law School. He has served for 30 years in the Attorney General's office in New York, protecting us New Yorkers, as well as state agencies and, and the people who work for them, officials in front of federal and state court. Many of them. I've even run into him on the job, but I digress. He's married to Barbara Hunter, who's class of 79, you might know her, who's a family physician and teaches and practices in the Bronx as well as in New York public schools. It's funny, he wrote in his bio he has 3 children. He actually has triplets, which is a whole different story. We also have the multi-talented Pam Jennings with us tonight. Pam has a PhD in clinical psychology, and she also has an MFA in painting and drawing. She's studied she has studied analysis, and she has formal training in that, and she has done some stuff on the psychoanalytic forces of racism and gender, among other things, and how those play out in people's adaptations to life. She lives in Brooklyn, and she has both a practice in psychology, and she has an active art practice. Marty Williams, such a slacker, graduated from Harvard Medical School. He has his boards in both internal medicine and surgery, and a certificate in critical care surgery. And I don't think they included the pictures in the class notes, but he sent me a picture of his surgery gear when operating on COVID patients. That was like, it was almost otherworldly. He looked so covered up. He's been chairman of surgery at Carney Hospital in Boston, and he's on several board of directors of nonprofits. His wife, Jennifer, is, I'm gonna have to say this word, maxillofacial and oral surgeon. Is that, did I get that?
Yes, you got it correct.
Yes. And they have a daughter who's a class of 17, Rebecca. They have 3 kids, but Rebecca went to Williams. So thanks again, all 3 of you, for lending your time. So I was talking to Chuckles about the topic, and it's okay to call you Chuckles. I hope
Yes.
I've known you for
Cool.
40 odd years. And he had mentioned something about, when we all arrived on campus 40 years ago, plus actually, and how we had all, arrived in Williamstown from totally different places. And I was thinking back, like, yeah, like I was 17 that fall. And I had so little life experience, and I assume it was the same for most of you guys. I knew what I knew. It was fairly sheltered growing up, and I did not have a clue where my other classmates were coming from. I mean, not just geographically, but I just knew so little about what people were bringing to Williams. So all that said, we're going to start our questions with the whole concept of journeys, not necessarily the journeys these three people took to Williams, but going back a few generations, the journeys that their family took as part of this great movement. And I guess, not everybody moved from the north from the south to the north in the Great Migration. Some people stayed in the south. And more commonly, some people in the family went north, some people stayed, a lot of families were split. So my first question is, if the three of you could just give us the outlines of your family's journey. We're going to get into the why they left or stayed after this, but if you can just give us sort of a geographical overview of the family, if that's not too complicated. And I'll do ladies first. Pam, please.
Okay. I'm going to talk really fast because Kate told us to keep our answers to 3 minutes. Okay, so I am mostly going to focus on my mother's family. Her maternal side of the family were named the Sanders, and her father's side of the family were the Thigpens. They were from the Craven County, Pollocksville area in North Carolina, specifically in and about the city of New Bern. I will also briefly review my father's family's journey, but I know a little less about that because he was less of a talker, basically. My mother liked narrating stories about her family history. My mother, Thelma Jennings, is the only child of Pearl Sanders, born in 1911, and Theodore Thigpen, born in 1910. As stated, they were from New Bern, North Carolina. My mother was born in 1930. Migration informed her life in a big way. My grandparents separated before her birth, and my grandfather moved to Philadelphia, where he settled for the rest of his life. He left my grandmother with his parents. Approximately 2 years after my mother's birth, my grandmother, Pearl, moved to New York, and my mother has always explained that she did so to find work. She left my mom with the Thigpens for about 5 years before sending for her. They lived in Brooklyn, for the most part in Bedford-Stuyvesant, where my grandmother lived until her death in 1973. My mother moved to Manhattan in 1954 to Harlem. She married my father in 54. My brother, who was in the Williams class of 76, my 2 younger sisters and I grew up in Harlem. My grandmother had a tragic childhood. She was orphaned by the age of 12. Both parents had died, and there were 2 brothers who were killed. It is not clear exactly how, but the story is that they burned in a fire. She was raised by her grandmother, who was born into slavery and was a little girl during the emancipation. There were others from my grandmother's family who migrated. They were mostly her contemporaries, such as siblings and cousins. She stayed with family when she first got to New York, and she offered a home to family members who migrated later. Of her 3 living siblings, Sue, Leo, and David, 2 came north, Sue and baby Leo. My mom's Uncle David stayed in the South, and you will hear more about him later. My father's family was from Camden, South Carolina. His nuclear family included 5 children, all of whom eventually migrated north and settled in New Jersey, the Bronx, and Manhattan. His mother also migrated. His father, reportedly college educated, was a skilled tailor and preacher. He died when my dad was 11 and never left the South. My dad had older siblings from his father's first marriage. They stayed in the South for the most part, but some did come to Philadelphia.
Wow. I feel like I still hear a little lilt of North Carolina that you must have picked up from your mom in your voice.
Yeah, it's very seductive. So
Yeah.
when I talk about it, I may slip
Not,
into it.
not straight New York for sure. Um, Chuckles, you want to go next?
Come from a large extended family. My mother was one of 10 children. My father was one of 6. And basically the family hails from the state of Georgia, and particularly in the country area as far as outside Augusta, between 2 big cities. You have Augusta and Atlanta. So my family were around that region. And let's just say under the circumstances, how the South was, particularly as far as in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, people had to make decisions as to what they wanted to do. And usually 3 things predicated: employment, education, and also housing as to what they wanted. And so my parents, they met in high school and basically got married as far as thereafter. And at 20 years of age, they had me as far as back home in Augusta, and I was born as far as in the colored section of University Hospital back there in Augusta. So at the time, you had to make decisions as far as what you wanted to do, because each generation of my family, as far as take for instance education, went another level. So when you look as far as all my grandparents and my older relatives, none of them had graduated from high school. So my parents' generation with my aunts and uncles and the younger ones, because my mother was number 7 of 10, that her older siblings did not necessarily finish high school, but she was. And again, they met in high school as far as my parents. And my father was the opposite. He was the oldest as far as of 6 children under the circumstances. So basically, they looked at what was available as far as in the area, and also they were looking at as far as what they wanted as far as for myself. And under the circumstances in Augusta, that the schools, as I said, were segregated, just in Georgia, period, because both my parents are athletes. They played sports all around the state, and the only schools that they could play against were against other Black schools located in different cities. So they did have an advantage because they did have an opportunity to travel. I mean, they traveled to all the cities, whether it was Savannah, whether Macon, Atlanta, and other places, and played schools. And they also had the opportunity to stay on the college campuses of the historically Black colleges and universities. So that was an advantage. But they looked at the circumstances as there. And so my mother was the 3rd child of my grandparents that moved up north. And if you're in Georgia, and with what Kate said as far as the migration, usually people from that area as far as Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia would follow as far as the coastal area, and they would go up as far as through the northeast. So that's the pattern that would follow as far as for there. While certain other southern states, central area, they would follow as far as the area, as far as where the jobs, and also basically as far as travel, as far as where the rivers, and they would move to the Midwest. And other people moved to the West Coast as far as that they were from other parts of the state of Mississippi, Texas, Oklahoma, and go to the West Coast. So my parents, as far as followed 2 of my parents' siblings to New York City, and my grandparents from my paternal side was also located there as to follow. And again, I looked at the comparisons that if I had remained in Augusta, the public schools did not integrate until at least 1964, 1965. I would have been either in 1st or 2nd grade at that particular stage. And at that year, there was only about 5 Black students that were allowed as far as in the white schools down there. And it wasn't until close to 1970 as far as that the high schools were integrated. So that was a motivating factor as far as for my parents as far as to come, and also for employment opportunities as to there. Now, also under the circumstances, you still had the connection as far as between Augusta and New York, and you still had a significant portion of my family as far as was there. And it's also something that Kate mentioned is that you had a circumstance with my family that you had a number of people as far as to remain, and also because of job opportunities, which we'll discuss later, as to that I had certain family members as far as that were disconnected as far as from their parents, who were raised as far as by other members of the family. And that's what counts as far as for extended families. So that was the motivating factor. And let's just say I prospered for it. And my parents always said that basically when they came up from Augusta to New York, they came up on the Greyhound bus. And there I was as far as on the pillow, as far as up there. And one quick story was that, again, due to segregation on the bus, they stopped off in Maryland, the Maryland House. And when they stopped there, they couldn't go into the front side of the building because blacks weren't allowed as far as to come in there. However, all the women folk went to that into the kitchen area. And fortunately for them, in the kitchen area was other black people who worked in the kitchen. So one of the ladies had said to them that this young lady, my mother, had a small child as far as about 4 months old, and that he needed a bottle. So they heated up the bottle, and they also gave food and sandwiches to everyone, all the blacks as far as there, since they knew they couldn't go as far as in the front. And that's part of the system. That's part as far as the support system that worked as far as at the time. And let's just say I benefited from it. And fortunately, I don't think I've missed a meal since.
That's amazing. What strikes me is that this is such recent history that, you know, we tend to think of segregation as something that happened so long ago, and it was part of all of our lives, you know, I mean, the 70s. Yeah. Marty, you're up.
Okay. Just like everyone else who spoke, I have a complicated family also. So there's almost, my mother's side of the family is from the South, from Virginia. They're from Brunswick County, Virginia. And then my father's family apparently moved to New Jersey in the 1830s from Virginia. So his family has been in the North for, almost a couple hundred years. My parents met at University of Michigan. And the reason for that is at that time, if you were black, you could not go to any of the graduate schools in Virginia. So because of separate but equal, they would pay for black college graduate students to go to integrated schools throughout America. So Virginia would pay for your tuition. So my mother was able to go to University of Michigan because of that. My father went to University of Michigan because of the GI Bill after he'd been one of the Tuskegee Airmen, and that's how they met. And from there, my father did not want to go back to Philadelphia, where he grew up, because of difficulties in inner city, and also with him being an aeronautical engineer, there were no job opportunities for him except in the federal government. I was fortunate that my son and Bill Spriggs, who was class of '77, helped me find out a lot about my early family. So as far as we can go back in 1790, that's when my father's family left Virginia. They were in the Delmarva Peninsula, probably no more than 30 miles from where I was born, across the Chesapeake Bay. And then my mother's family, with Mary Jackson, she was born in 1812 in Blackstone, Virginia, before she went to Brunswick County. And she was obviously, she was a slave. My father's family, from the records, they were free from at least 1790. So they were freedmen in Virginia in 1790. My father then had to learn how to adapt to segregation in Virginia when he started working at NASA in 1951. But he made a very good adaptation from the best I can tell. I grew up in the segregated city. I was born in Dixie Hospital in the black section. And that's also a story in and of itself. And, but because my father was Catholic, he had us going to the Catholic schools there in Hampton, Virginia. But the Catholic schools segregated out the black students for recreation, for physical education. So the black students at the Catholic school could not play with the white kids during free time. But eventually they were able to change that. And the nuns were very upset at my father for having to change that. I was fortunate that I was pretty much going to school with white kids for my entire education. And I had, I went to a very high level public high school in Hampton, Virginia. So that's why I was able to matriculate to Williams College. And that's, as far as my mother's family is concerned, they left the South to go to Delaware and to New York City. And that was mainly for economic reasons. And they were all educated. My great-grandfather, as a matter of fact, finished college in Richmond, Virginia, back in the, like in the 1890s. So that's my family.
I can't believe how far back you're able to trace your family. That's remarkable.
Oh,
How
yeah.
many people can go back that far? That's incredible. So, you know, I talked in general terms about, you know, conditions in the South, but can you guys sort of just give me examples of your own personal family? I don't know, maybe there's stories you heard from your grandparents or your parents of the kind of things that they were facing that made, and I know, Chuckles, you talked about your parents wanting you to, you know, grow up with a different kind of education, but do you remember certain stories that stick out in your head, or what the family lore was of why we had to go, or why some people had to go, or why we decided to stay on a very personal level? Pam?
Actually, I have lots of stories from my mother, especially, both good and bad, about life in the South, and you know, what kind of pushed them to move north. And it really dovetails a lot with Wilkerson's book. And I thought one of the things that she did in her book so well was describe this whole idea that, you know, there was emancipation, and then there was the Reconstruction, and a certain amount of like freedom and growth around that. Then there was the taking of all of that away with Jim Crow laws. And my mother, you know, was born kind of right into that moment where Blacks were losing some of the gains that they had found after slavery. My mother, you know, told us lots of stories, you know, that basically depicted Jim Crow, although of course, you know, she was just telling us stories about her life, not necessarily trying to teach us about Jim Crow. She remembers, for example, being a little girl with her grandmother Leela on trips, going on trips into town. They lived on a farm, and they would go into New Bern. And she remembers that her grandmother Leela would have to take her by the hand and guide her from the sidewalk into the street so that whites could pass. My mother's still mad about that. Like, I mean, it's not going to ever change. She also recalls the humiliation of her mother's brother, her Uncle David, who I mentioned earlier, and who remained in the South. And she stayed with him during her summer visits when she moved north. You know, she went back south every summer. Her Uncle David was a sharecropper. And sharecropping, as most of you know, was an exploitative system in which landowners deducted the cost of the land, supplies, and housing from the sharecropper's harvest. My mother described the power dynamic that she witnessed between her Uncle David and the landowners that he worked for. And she really recalls painfully the idea that the landowners expected to be called Mr., whatever his last name was, but he would call my Uncle David, you know, by his first name, which was humiliating, especially in front of his children and his niece. My mother said that her uncle would lower his head in submission and humiliation. Nonetheless, her Uncle David did not migrate north and eventually owned his own land. Apparently, there was a white female landowner who was willing to sell him land and also to protect his land when necessary. For example, my mom said that there was a period when David was quite ill, and this woman made sure that he did not lose his land. He eventually accrued enough land for his children to have land, and they stayed in the South. My mother was very close to her first cousins. So, you know, she got to benefit from the land that her uncle owned. Um, let's see, when I was little, my mother took us south once to visit her cousins. I was about 12. And we had a choice of staying on the farm or in New Bern proper in the city. And I have to say, it was the best vacation that I had as a child. My mother dressed me and my two sisters in what was the style of the day. I don't know if you guys remember these poor boy suits, flowered pants, and ribbed tops, mock turtlenecks.
Uh-huh.
And we went south via Trailways. My father worked for Trailways. I remember the trip as a moment of complete freedom, riding bikes down hills as fast as I could go with no worries about personal safety, no mean streets, you know, nothing like growing up in Harlem. I did not, however, like farm life. And I stayed in the city with my mother and youngest sister while my brother and other sister stayed on the farm and rode pigs instead of bikes. So everybody had a really good time, I think, in the end. Aging sent some of the family members back to the South. My grandmother's sister Sue returned in her 70s when rheumatoid arthritis made New York City just too difficult for her to negotiate. Very briefly, my father grew up very poor. One story I learned during my childhood was that he did not have shoes to wear to school. He stopped school in the 5th grade because his shoes were worn out. He never went back to school, but he did teach himself to read and write. And I recently learned that one of his jobs as a kid was as a golf caddy, which I found fascinating because golf was his #1 hobby. He was an avid golfer. So hopefully that gives you guys some ideas.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, this is all about putting personal stories on a period in history. That was wonderful. Thank you. Jackals?
Well, it's interesting because there are a number of stories that I believe my family members suppressed as far as informing us and talking to us as far as when we were younger. But part of the experience again went to as far as the family that there was a lot of splintering as to because there wasn't that many job opportunities because it's interesting what Pam is indicating as far as the family because my family also started, as I said, outside of Augusta in an agrarian type of farming area, but they couldn't make a go of it. So they moved to the big city as far as Augusta at the time. But still as far as jobs. So under the circumstances, in order to come up north, and also certain jobs. And I will say that a significant number of the women folks, as far as my family, work as the domestics as far as in the New York area. And let's just say they were living as far as with the families, working on a full-time basis as far as there. And so if you're working as far as on that basis, that you really can't bring your family members because you're not going to be able to take care of them unless you have someone else. So my father was someone there. So the oldest 4 children on my paternal side remained in the South and was living there rather than as far as coming as far as up north. And that's something that basically he was dedicated to as to wanting to keep his family as far as together as well. But it's also a situation that, again, making choices that as far as with opportunities, because I remember one of my aunts from my maternal side, when she came to New York at first, she was looking for a job. And then she was able to get a job as far as in nursing. But something that she disclosed to me as far as at a later time when I was older was that she basically did not fully disclose her educational record, or I should say, she manipulated it. She basically indicated that she was a graduate of high school when she had not attained a degree. And for her, it was something that always bothered her because she was always concerned and afraid that basically if they found out that she would get terminated from her job. And let's just say I realized that was a legitimate consideration by her because let's just say there are a number of cases that we handle as far as my office where if somebody doesn't fully and properly disclose as far as their educational or employment record, they could be subject to termination. But I will say it worked out well in my aunt. I would say was one of the good people. She was a deacon of the church, sung in the choir, you know, did a number of things, but that was her little one line that she said that she told as far as in the time, as far as her. I also say it's interesting as far as when you live a certain lifestyle that you realize as far as how things are different. And part of it is discussing it, particularly either with my children in my Sunday school class, as far as travel, as an example. And it's something that I say for them, they take it for granted that now you travel, particularly by car, you want to stop off at whether, at a Holiday Inn, you want to stop off, eat here and there. The times when we went back home, as far as to Augusta, one of the things as far as for safety and caution was that no one ever really drove by themselves. It was always a group of people in tandem that would travel together. And it was also a situation in traveling that I knew at that point that you would also travel with a certain amount of cash. Because if it was a situation that you would stop as far as by the police in the South, and for whatever reasons, that basically that you would have to pay cash on the barrel as far as if you got a ticket for whatever reason. And if you wasn't able to pay, that you would basically get incarcerated as far as for a period of time as far as there. So that was a situation as far as for people being prepared. It's also at that time when I was younger that realizing as far as, because I wanted to stop off, at a place as far as to eat, but we couldn't because again, the places were not open as far as to us. And so therefore it was always a situation that we all traveled as far as bringing, big lunches and things. And at that point, there was a number of roadside tables that you could stop off as far as when traveling. But it wasn't until later on, as far as an opportunity opened, because as I said, now people take it for granted as far as traveling, that you're able to do that. But we had as far as a good time as far as going back and forth. I will also say it's interesting as far as another note that my cousins back home in Augusta always enjoyed as far as for me to come there, because one of the first things they did was to take me, gather with friends, and tell me to say something. Because since I had a New York accent, I was the person with the funny accent as far as talking, as far as with that. So therefore, that was something that they always were able to do as far as my coming from New York. Also, I was the bridge. Since I was born in Augusta, grew up in New York, as far as there was something that was quite important. And it was something that also I have to say that I learned very early on, that I could not be seen as an uppity New York. So therefore, whenever I was in the neighborhood, as far as going around, that I would always say my highs and properly as far as talk, as far as with people. And I remember one time that I passed one of the neighbors. And when I came back to my grandmother's house, she indicated to me, did you see Miss Jones as far as on her porch when you passed by? I said, yeah, I saw her. Anyway, she said, you didn't say anything as far as to her. So I said, Grandma, I'll go right back. So I marched back around the corner, went up to her porch, said hi, sat a spell. She gave me iced tea, a little cake as far as to eat. And therefore, I made my amends and as far as returned home. So therefore, let's just say this uppity New Yorker knew his place.
Although in my experience, he's a very proud New Yorker, and you definitely do have a great New York accent. Thank you, Chuckles. Marty, how about you? Any stories that stick out, or?
Yeah, I think one, I had an Aunt Rosa, and Aunt Rosa, whenever we would visit Richmond, Virginia, she would ask my mother to take her to a high-end restaurant. And I didn't know what this was about, but once when I was little, they let me go there with them. And Rosa would sit down and would kind of criticize what the waitresses were doing. So I asked my mother, what was that about? And she said that Rosa had been a waitress in these high-end restaurants, but that when the telephone companies switched to automatic switching, that all of the white women that were the telephone operators, they were fired. So what they did was they basically fired all of the black waitresses in the high-end restaurants in Richmond. They hired them. So Rosa was fired with that. So I think it was her come up and to be able to go and have them serve her. So she'd always have my mother take her to the restaurant, and the whole time she was there, she would be looking down her nose at the way that they were doing things, because she was very proud at her waitressing. And so that's one thing that I can recall. There are a lot of things I could probably say. I think one interesting one is that I had an uncle by marriage who was a physician who I really never met, but apparently what had happened with him is that a country doctor was offered to buy some property off of Chesapeake Bay up in Middlesex County. At that time, they weren't allowing blacks to live on the water, just like right now, it's very expensive to live off the water. But this white gentleman had gone to Dr. Tony and said, do you want to buy this property? But Dr. Tony's a country doctor, he didn't have any money, so my Uncle George in Richmond, he had the money to buy it. And what the folklore is that during World War II, this gentleman would sit on this bluff overlooking Chesapeake Bay, and the people in Middlesex County accused him as being a Nazi spy. So when the war was over, he decided to sell all the property. So he probably was a Nazi spy. But to get at the people that were accusing him of this, he said, I'll sell it to black people. So he sold it, must have been like 150 acres. And from that time on, people have been trying to steal the property from us, but they haven't been successful. So those are just two stories that I just wanted to bring up.
Well, those are good ones. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, anyone who knows anything about history also knows that when Black people left the South, it wasn't like they were coming into some panacea of justice in the North by any means. And one more quote, only other one I'm going to do for the night. After getting beaten in Chicago, Martin Luther King Jr. said, I've seen many demonstrations in the South, but I have never seen anything so hostile and so hateful as I've seen here today. So can you guys all each talk about what it was like when those family members who did moved to the North, what they found? Were they surprised? Was it, I mean, what was the experience when they got here? Pam?
Just in general, you know, I would have to say, you know, that my parents didn't talk much about running into, you know, a lot of negative situations when they got here. But there are the stories of, you know, like how hard it was for my father to, you know, to deal with some of the racism on his jobs. And then also immigration was a big issue. Like, for instance, you know, he had to deal with the idea that sometimes he would get laid off or lose his job because an immigrant would get the job and would accept lower pay. So there was a lot of that kind of stuff. But in general, I think it still was sort of like a situation where they experienced more opportunity. You know, definitely more pros than cons for the most part. My grandmom worked as a maid for Jewish families in Kings County, basically all of her life. Kings County is Brooklyn. And generally speaking, it was a hard life. You know, it was hard to be a maid. Before my mom came up, she basically lived in, you know, she slept in with the families she worked for. Then when she sent for my mom, she would work during the day and go home, but she couldn't go home until she did dinner, you know, and got the families that she worked for settled, especially the children. She did form, you know, bonds and attachments to the families, again, especially the children. I'm in fact named after one of the little girls that she worked for, Pamela Sue. And I'm not sure how that child got that name, Pamela Sue. But anyway, it's now my name too. My grandmother, though, you know, basically told my mom she was working as a maid. She was cooking for other people. She was cooking specifically for white people, and that was not what she wanted for my mother. And so she just always impressed upon my mother the idea that, you know, she was to finish school and she was to get a decent job. My mother herself, when she got to Brooklyn, pretty much as a, you know, about ready for, I guess, late elementary school, early middle school, you know, I think she had a pretty, what seems to me like a pretty good life. She went to what was then a good high school, Girls High. She learned Latin. She spells better than any of her children. She can break down a word to divine its meaning better than we can. None of us, of course, had Latin. As a youth, she joined an acting troupe with the Urban League. She was very active in her church. Her church was very nurturing of youth. She went to the Cornerstone Baptist Church. The minister that she had knew Martin Luther King. So there were lots of like good influences around. My mom herself had a dream of being an actress. Her first job actually was in a sweater factory. She was counseled out of the job by a supervisor who saw her potential and told her that a factory job was not right for her. She then took a test for the telephone company and performed quite well, even though she was initially lacking in confidence because most of the applicants were white. She was the first to be offered a job from the group of applicants, and my grandmother was very proud of her. And she, you know, did well and worked in the phone company until she got married to my father. A very interesting part of my mother's story is that she and my grandmother rented an apartment in a brownstone owned by Sidney Bechet, who was the masterful soprano saxophonist who, along with Louis Armstrong, was credited with forming the roots of jazz. So go figure. This totally excites me. My mother acts like it's no big deal. She just sort of happened to tell us one day. I'm just sort of like kind of flabbergasted by it myself. My mom does not remember Sidney Bechet as much as she remembers his wife, Laura. And she remembers Laura because Laura had a huge dog, sounds like a Great Dane, and my mom did not like the dog. And, you know, my mom tells stories about how much Laura liked my grandmother's cooking. My mom would never say she was particularly influenced by jazz or Bechet, but she married a musician because my father played the trumpet and played in bands when she met him. My father's life was definitely made better by coming north. There's just no question about it. He availed himself of opportunities to learn and work. He moved from cleaning trailway buses to learning the upholstery trade and refrigeration. Following the development of early heart disease, he had to stop the refrigeration, and he became a licensed locksmith. There's just no question that his life was better from coming north, migrating north.
Okay, I just realized, thank you, Pam. See, this is the problem. I'm terrible. I thought I would be okay at moderating, but I've gotten wrapped up in every single story and we've completely lost track of time. Okay, I have completely lost track of time. And there's a couple of questions I want to ask. So I'm going to just have to ask Chuck and Marty, can you give a very brief response to this one so we can get to the like last question or two and open it up for comments, because I just mismanaged the time. Sorry. Chuck.
No, I think that under the circumstances, I think the biggest shock that my family always went through as far as moving up was density, as far as New York City. Coming from Augusta, New York City, I mean, the amount of people and just living as far as there. One thing that was always good was the social network. The social network worked real well because there was connection as far as in different neighborhoods, and the biggest aspect was the churches. And similar to what Pamela mentioned as far as Cornerstone Baptist Church, which I know quite well in Brooklyn, because my family's church wasn't that far from it. You have people there, and let's just say that within the church, you always have people, you have many clubs as far as by the states, the North Carolina Club, the Virginia Club, the Georgia Club, and people would gather, trade stories, and also have a connection as far as back home. Biggest aspect I will say as far as adaptation is housing. And that is something that they see not being able to move to any particular type of neighborhood and finding out that how codified neighborhoods were in New York City, similar to the South, where basically you only have one type of group as far as to live in different places. And let's just say that was everywhere. Just another example, not necessarily for myself, but someone here where I live now in Westchester, that his family in the 1950s wanted to purchase a house near where we live. And basically, as a Black family, they were not allowed to purchase the house directly. They had to have a straw person. So they had to have a white family with whom that they knew and got along with to purchase the house on their behalf. and then to turn over and sell them the house as far as there because of whether it was restricted covenants or people not wanting to sell. And I think that was the biggest aspect as far as changeover, as far as coming, that they thought that they were leaving something behind, but as far as coming, as far as to New York area, that was the one disappointing aspect that they found out. Education-wise, as far as for me and as far as for people, it worked out well, you know, under those circumstances. But again, when I was in Brownsville, as far as, which was at that point low-income neighborhood, living in public housing, I was bused out the neighborhood, but I was bused to a great area where we were some of the few blacks and Latinos, and we went to a school that was all white, but I prospered and did well. I had a great time as far as there, and let me as far as to the other public schools, as far as within New York, both in Brooklyn and Queens, that have worked out. So let's just say the educational part did work as far as what my family was trying to achieve, not only for myself, but also for my other cousins who also were in the New York area.
Thank you. And I've actually seen the literal maps drawn of where white families could live and where black families could live. And there'd be certain roads that were like the cutoffs. And that was just in Westchester, so I know. Anyway, time. Marty.
I don't have anything to add to this question. So.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to combine our last two questions and just wrap this up. You know, I was thinking about this. I'm sitting here talking to a surgeon, a deputy attorney general, a psychologist, and artist. And, you know, in certain ways, you guys are all like illustrations of, oh, this is the success of migration, right? This is what, you know, your great-grandparents maybe dreamed of. But I also think that's a little bit misleading. You know, I actually don't know anything about what people would think. But how do you view, like, how do you view what your great-grandparents, grandparents, and parents did in terms of their movement or even their choices to stay that made you who you are today? And this is the last question, so you can throw whatever you have at it within timing reasons. Pam?
I just think that they, their big dream was just education. You know, it wasn't even work in a way. Everything was about education. Everything was about education. So they just wanted to make it, you know, my grandparents wanted to make it so that my parents could learn, and my parents wanted to make it so that we could learn. And they weren't greedy, you know, they weren't demanding, you know, all that demanding in a way. My parents were, you know, they didn't say you had to be this, you had to be that, you had to go to this school, you had to go to that school. They were like, just finish school so that you can take care of yourself. And so I think what actually wound up happening was like icing on the cake for them, you know. So I won't take a lot of time, but I think it was education. It was the dream.
Okay. Chuckles?
But definitely it's education, because under just what occurred, as I said, with my family, each generation that came along, we went a level up as far as being educated. As I said, when we go back to my great-grandparents and grandparents, they did not finish school. We go back to my parents, as far as their generation, they were the first ones to finish high school. And so it wasn't until me and my cousins come along that we're the first ones to attend college. And actually at the time, me and one of my cousins back home, we were the first ones to go away to college under the circumstances as to attend school. And so that is a progression that they foresaw. Also, I have to say that it was interesting because though my parents were motivating me, I was self-motivated and didn't have to do as much, because basically I was influenced, and as well the rest of my cousins, as far as by the civil rights movement, as to growing up, because that's going on contemporaneous. It's going on as far as where our family remained, as far as for there. So let's just say as I'm growing up, basically the two biggest influences in my life as far as wanting to be was whether or not I wanted to be a preacher or wanted to be an attorney. And since I didn't like going to church every Sunday, attorney was my choice as far as I'm concerned. So, but that was, you know, because you're living as far as there. And I think also within the family, and as far as having people from a disparate background, and still achieving a certain educational level, it was still basically keeping things as far as within context. Because one of the things that we did learn is no matter how much education that you may have, how much book sense, you got to have some common sense as far as in doing and achieving things. And that's something that always kept the heart, and let's just say being humble as to with who you are and what you are, because again, you may not have as far as everyone the same educational level, but let's just say I learned and people, there was a lot of hard work. Let's just say by means of Williams wasn't the first place where I learned that you work hard through Saturday and play hard during the weekend. That was something that was ingrained as far as within our family members, as far as what they did. So that is the aspect. And I think that's always something that kept the connection as far as me and my family members as to who we were, despite as far as continuously gaining, further levels of education.
Okay, well, I've known you a long time, and I think there's a little preaching in your law work and a little, I think that came through as in your whole life. What about you, Marty?
As I said, I'm very fortunate that my family's been pretty much educated from my mother's side, at least formally educated for quite some time, especially with, said, my great-grandfather finished college, which is kind of amazing for me.
Great-grandfather.
This other family, they went up north a long time ago, and they ended up being basically not well formally educated. So my father was the first one to go to college when he finished University of Michigan, but that was through the GI Bill with him being a Tuskegee Airman. But what he did though was his nephews, pretty much quite a few of them followed his way into the military, and through that became accomplished in what they were doing. So, so I think that he was kind of the step off where everyone wanted to be like Uncle Jim. And because of that, quite a few of that next generation had gone to college, and the generation after that. So, and that was basically through the military. So, Korean War, Vietnam War, wars in the Middle East. So that's what's kind of developing the family right now in Philadelphia.
Actually, it's interesting, Marty, you mentioned as far as the Vietnam War, and I will say is for my family back home, all the men through the 60s and early 70s, that since none of them were continuing advancing in education, every single one of my family members got drafted. Every one of them went to Vietnam. Fortunately, they survived, but that was one of the things as far as in the area, that they were the main people. And it was just, actually I have to say, in one way, it wasn't just the blacks, but also as far as the South, as far as the whites who did not receive a college education, they were the main people that served this country as far as through Vietnam under the circumstances.
Very true. Very true. Honest to God, I feel like I could sit here for hours and listen to these stories. I have so much more to ask you, but as I said, I mismanaged the time, so it's time for your questions. But I almost want to ask to do a part 2, but I won't push my luck right now. We haven't even talked about the present day and everything, but we won't. We'll end on that. So questions, you can raise your hand. And by the way, Marty and Charles and Pam have all graciously agreed to stay a bit over time, so we can push this a little and they can tell us when they've hit their limit, because Marty's still at the hospital and he hasn't had dinner yet, and I can't speak for the food status of Pam and Chuckles, but
Dr. Doom.
So John, can you kind of do the question thing? Because I'm not that good at that.
I got it, Kate. Great job, team. And really appreciate
And
it.
oh, wait, can I say one more thing?
Yeah.
Pam and Chuckles and Marty, thank you so much. This was so fascinating. Really appreciate your time and preparation. Thank you.
Thank you.
And there have been a
Good
number.
time.
Yeah, there's a number of folks that have written some amazing comments in the chat section. So I'll share it with the panelists afterwards in case you don't get a chance to see it. But very good, heartfelt words. So thank you all. So actually, the first question is from Debbie Robinson. Debbie, are you on?
Hey, yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This has been really great. Okay, Al Gentry, I think you need to mute yourself. Anyway, so this has been great. I've known you guys, but obviously didn't know all these stories. Since I've been really involved trying to write down, do a lot of genealogical research and write down my family stories. I was wondering, is that something you guys are doing? Are you writing down these stories, or is someone else in your family doing that? Thanks.
I want to write them down. I want to actually also just like, I really want to write down what my mother says, because I think she's so good at telling these stories. But she's actually a little shy when it comes to that. So the whole question of how to actually do it, I'm going to have to ask Kate about. Because, you know, Kate's the journalist, so she's going to have to tell me how to do that. I have myself done some genealogical, you know, research. You know, I do ancestry.com, and so you know, I get a lot of the information that way. But the actual stories, I want my mother's stories like verbatim.
Pam, you got to get the tape recorder out now. You're not going to get them back, so just sit her down with the tape recorder. That's really brilliant, insightful advice. But
No, it's interesting what you're saying, Kate and Pam, as far as your question, Debbie, that it's been quite difficult as far as for me and questions of my family, because just trying to trace, it's been a difficult situation, because also as far as the birth history, things not being recorded, because just different birthdays, as an example, my family members. If you were born as far as in the country area, you may have been born on a certain day. However, until that you either went to a hospital, a doctor came along, that would be adopted as your birthday. So I have to say, for a number of family members, they got multiple birthdays, you know, under the circumstances. Actually, it's interesting. The one aspect that my family members have done, not genealogically, but have traded, and let's just say, I will say for my family, and I think a number of other my families are similar, is trying to write down recipes. Because let's just say, by learning as far as to cook, basically you learn over the stove as far as how to cook a meal. If you ask anyone as far as to do like Betty Crocker and say, do an ounce of this or a pinch of that, you're only going to get an answer. Boy, just listen and watch me and you'll learn as far as how to cook this. So that is one thing that we've been trying to do as far as through the generation, as far as collecting recipes and just keeping that as far as within the family, because there's different types of cakes and other things that family members have made that, again, it's done from scratch. And if you don't write it down, you're going to lose it. And as I said before, I do love to eat.
I did a history project when I was at Williams that went over part of my genealogy. And then my son picked it up this year when he was at Middlebury College and did a semester free study, I guess, independent study about pretty much my father's family. So we've kind of brought that together. But I'm very fortunate that my mother's 92, she's still alive, and although she can't walk, her brain's pretty much together and her mouth's definitely together. So I need to go and spend some time with her. And my son did, so he got quite a bit of information from her. I was fortunate that my father, before he died, the U.S. Park Service, whatever, came and spoke to him and recorded him talking for several hours about his experience as a Tuskegee Airman. And I tried to access that, but most of it's closed with the COVID right now. So the Library of Congress, it's very hard to get any information right now. But once everything opens up, I hope to be able to listen to him speak for a few hours about his stories.
Debbie, thanks for that question. Actually, the next one is from Ed Friedland.
Yeah, so not a question, but a comment. First, a thank you to Pam, Marty, and Chuck for sharing your stories. You know, it's just so incredible to hear them. And for Chuck in particular, Chuck and I drove from New York to Georgetown in, was 1978, 1979.
Yes.
We're going to law school. And I didn't have a clue about so many things. And, you know, so much of what we thought was ancient history was just really right in the rearview mirror. And sitting here tonight, I'm just struck by the fact it's taken 40 years for these stories to come out. And I guess it's good to be patient and good to wait, because it's been really gratifying after all these years to hear you guys share the stories. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ed, it's interesting because Kate and I, Kate indicated at the beginning, under the circumstances. And one of the things as far as the topics that we were considering and also, interacting as far as with Pam on this, let's just say we were hoping that this type of conversation that we're having today would not necessarily just be one off, and that there's many journeys that people have taken as far as circumstances. And it's, basically we are successful people having gone to Williams to achieve what we are. But it's not necessarily as far as looking at all of that as the sole benchmark. I think it's more of an understanding as far as who and what we are, and sharing as far as those stories and information. And that's something that we wanted to commit to continuing a dialogue and conversation with people as far as within the class. Because I think there's a lot that we have as far as within each other. And again, it's a situation that we all came up there 16, 17, 18, 19 years old from different places, disparate areas and things. And there's a lot as far as that, where we once became that developed us to who we were as far as that time and to who we are now. So we're hoping that this will continue as far as with other stories and other people, whether in different ways, and just sharing as far as on that personal level as far as for the class.
And by the way, we have to give credit to Chuck because this was his vision, this topic. So we have to give credit to Chuck and thank Chuck, because this has actually helped me integrate a lot. It's been very useful for me to do.
I agree. Thank you, Chuck. And also, since we're doing personal stories, hey, Ed, I haven't seen you in roughly 40 years. Thank you for letting me live on your couch and Chuckles when you guys were at Georgetown. Great that you're here. Thank you, too.
I've been waiting for that thank you for oh so long.
I was only there like 6 months.
I'll say the idea of this program, 78 Connect, really came out when several of us were at a reunion and Marty was talking about his family history. And I think, the room was packed and people's, were in awe of your stories. And just as we said, how do we continue these conversations? So I think this is, as Kate said in the beginning, our fourth 78 Connect, and each one brings different perspectives and into people's lives and our classmates' lives. And it's great to see now. I know the colleges, they're really trying to replicate that among other classes. So, like once again, 78 is taking a leadership role, and we appreciate that. And again, we want to continue to do more of these. So there'll be a survey coming out right after this call, by the way, and then there'll be a letter coming out from the class officers in looking at, how do we continue the conversation, especially around anti-racism and other topics which are so important. And I think our class is very open on that, and keep your eyes out for that. So we're always looking for more ideas and ways that we can support that. So we have a few more minutes. Any other questions? Anybody want to raise their hand, or I can unmute or shoot a question our way, but conversations are still going. No more questions.
Am I unmuted?
Oh, yeah,
Thank you so much. I enjoyed all the stories. Wonderful. And yeah, Marty, I had talked with you when I saw you in the vineyard about how I started doing genealogy, and I'm enjoying it so much and finding out so much about my family, and a lot of the things that each one of you mentioned are very similar.
Wow.
And I guess I just would add that activism is in my family. On my mother's side, Unita Blackwell was through marriage related to my cousin, and she was the mayor of Marysville, Mississippi, first Black woman mayor. And she was very involved in SNCC and those sort of things. But just enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Actually, it's interesting, Debbie, because you're also an example as far as for us, as far as your family, as far as that are coming east, you all went west.
Yes, yes. That's because an uncle of mine was already there, and we came to move to live with him, my father's uncle, my great uncle. And that's how we ended up west. So by train, we came. So it's an interesting story too, but I know you don't have much time, but I enjoyed all of your stories very much.
Oh,
thanks, Deb. We have a Quentin Durning. You're out there.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Can you
Yeah.
Well, how my signal is coming far away. Good. Good to see you guys. Thank you very much, man. Listen, this might be more of a part two, kind of a big question. I think back on my time at Williams, and peripherally, and a few people through classes or working in the studio with Dan Perkins. I mean, got to know some people in the Black community, but it wasn't that easy for subtle reasons that I myself don't necessarily understand. And I'm very curious about if you guys at some stage, maybe a part two, can talk about the Williams experience coming up, as a minority community within the Williams situation through the Black Union and all, and just what it meant to be a part of that little white bubble up there in New England, and of course what you brought to it, and also what you experienced. Stories I wish I'd shared with you 40 years ago, but I didn't have the wherewithal and the courage to be aware. But anyway, thank you very much for today. Thank you. That's my question. Good to see you all.
Good to see you too. Thank you.
If I can answer a little bit of that, for me, it was, it's a different world coming up to Williams from Virginia. But fortunately, because I played tennis and they taught me how to play squash, I had quite a few friends that grew up from a completely different background than I did. And I think that we spent quite a bit of time talking and kind of delving into people's lives and pasts and our futures. So I thought that by me playing those sports really helped out me become more comfortable with the college.
Actually, it's interesting what you say, Quentin, as far as the question that you asked, and also Marty's indicating, I think two opportunities developed as far as for me, as far as coming to Williams to be acclimated prior to. One is academically, and having been as far as I said, since grade school, being in predominantly as far as white institutions, and also achieving. So it wasn't a situation where I felt that my academic training was deficient. I was able to do well academically as far as throughout, and so therefore it was comfortable as far as for me in class. But also I have to say, athletically, that having, some of the Marty, I wasn't per se as far as tennis, but playing other sports, particularly football and baseball and other sports, that particularly in the area of Queens in which I was living, that we played as far as other places within New York City, and also as far as out in Long Island, as far as different places. But it's also a situation, again, looking at my particular neighborhood where I was, and it is interesting as to learning because it was a demarcation line. I mean, always in the South, you always hear the terminology living on the other side of the tracks. And let's just say for me in Queens, living on the side of the tracks was the Long Island Railroad, because on the south side of the tracks, that's where the neighborhood was integrated. And on the north side of the tracks, it was all white. But again, as far as with the different places where I played sports, as far as I played with all of them. And when I was at Williams, when I had an urban economics class with Professor Joseph Kershaw, I did a paper on it and concerning blockbuster. And as far as how, and also showing improving that basically when blacks did move in, as far as in the Queens area, that the socioeconomic factors did not go down, but they increased because the nature of the people who moved in the area, in order to purchase, they had to have a higher income. And he asked me, he says, how did you know this? I said, I lived it, I grew up with it. And it was self-evident as far as for there, because it's something that you could visually see, and as far as knowing. But again, as far as for coming to Williams, first is, adaptation. I think for a number of us, the biggest thing to adapt to is the cold weather.
Absolutely. Well, that's great. Any other question? I don't see any more hands out there. Maybe I'll say a quick comment, but I really appreciate everybody being on there. There was a comment about part two. So I really like that. Again, I will share all the comments that have come in tonight. Make sure you fill out the feedback forms if you can, and any other ideas and thoughts or topics that we can continue to support as a leadership team would be great. But Kate, thank you for obviously moderating, and Chuck and Pam, and Marty. What else can we say? Great job, and appreciate you really sharing personal stories with us tonight.
That's great.
Great.
A pleasure.
Hey, thank you. I
Thanks,
appreciate
everyone.
that.
This was great.
Much. This is wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Thank you. It's good to see you guys.
I know. I wish I could talk to everyone.
I know.
Jay, do you want us to stay on?
Maybe just for a sec, we can do a recap.
All right.
Hey, Debbie Foy.
Hi, Debbie.
Hey. Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Look at all these people. Oh man, I wish I could.
Hi,
talk to
everyone.
Barb.
Find my button. Hi, Debbie. Hi,
Debbie.
Pam. Everybody.
Does anyone remember Romper Room when
Yes.
we like, I see Chuck, I see Marty, I see Jessica, I see Barbara, I see Julie, I see Pam, there's Liza.
That was our Sesame Street romper room.
Yeah, much.
Well, that's the advantage of Zoom, man. We can all just be there so quickly, even though it's we're all over the place. But thank goodness for technology. It does bring us together a little bit easier
Yeah.
than trying to get a reunion gathering in a certain location. But
Anyway, I don't know what more to say. I thought it went well. I'm more interested in what Marty, Chuckles, and Pam thought.
Oh, I thought it went well too. I mean, of course I was, somewhat anxious, and so, there's a lot probably I didn't hear. Time just kind of flies by when you're kind of anxiously participating. But I thought it went really. Generally, I thought it went really well. I enjoyed it.
It was interesting because the question that we asked as far as by Zoom session, we could work, we thought that by the topic, it could, let's just say the conversation could definitely be a whole lot easier and better if you all were encapsulated within the room as far as discussing as far as there, and you could have a good ebb and flow as far as with people. But as far as to tell your story, as far as tell your journey, I think it goes well because I think all of us, not just us participants, but also other people, we had a good time growing up. Let's just say our families are great, in a sense, and, this is who, they made us who we are under the circumstances, and there's no disengagement as far as the people that we are directly is derived as far as from our family members. And so you build on as far as each generation, over time. And that's something which I'll talk about and brag about anytime as far as my family. So that's cool.
Marty, were you happy with it? You okay with it?
Yeah, I am. I'm still kind of thinking about what Quentin Durning said about kind of bringing it up to how things were from 74 to 78 after we entered Williams bubble. And I probably have to sit down and kind of think back on that because I've kind of put it in the back and I need to bring up forward. Totally where I am now I am where I am now because of my experiences at Williams. But as far as my interactions with the students and black and white interactions while I was at Williams, I really haven't sat and thought about that before. So I would like to sit down and speak with people about that.
That's really interesting because as Pam and John know, like we've been tossing around different topics since we began this whole idea of 78 Connect. And the one I proposed was what I wish my white classmates had known about being at Williams in the 70s. And Pam didn't think it was a great idea just in terms of putting people on the spot. And also we'd sort of been doing, and Pam, tell me if I'm paraphrasing this wrong, but people had been getting, talking about, oh, I'm a sleep doctor, or I teach in the prisons, or, talking about their accomplishments. And then we're going to turn around and ask our black classmates to talk about their pain because it wasn't always like such a great experience. And so we backed off from that, although it was something that I thought it'd be interesting, but maybe it's interesting to me as a voyeur or, someone who's just curious, and that it was a difficult time for people. So I'd love to know your thoughts. And then also, in light of the Breonna Taylor ruling and everything yesterday, I mean, how do we bring this up to current, or do we want to? I mean, this is a way for classmates to connect, but I don't,
It's interesting, Kate, because one of the things that we have been talking about, and I look at it now, first of all, and I look at with the COVID-19 situation that's occurring. We're blessed as far as all of us as a class, whether we're black or white, as far as having the ability to do. Because I tell my children that under the circumstances, that looking as far as the community, that let's just say during this time, I can look as far as here, as far as the train station, White Plains one of the biggest. Only recently, I counted the number of cars that's in the station is only 40, because the people, as far as the socioeconomic factors, that people are able to work from home. But there's a big divide, because even my office is an example as far as in other places where I'm one of the few black attorneys, but let's just say the essential workers, around America are primarily as far as people of color, and they're working, having to go, to their jobs, while other people are able to navigate and stay home, and as far as in work. And that's part what is education and others. And let's just say, the type of jobs that blacks have historically had, and again, all according to educational level, they have historic paying jobs. But again, if you're a social service worker, if you're working as far as the public DMV, if you're a nurse, under the circumstances in other places, these are the people that are key, but they're having to go in, and therefore, and now the whole situation as far as with childcare, what are you going to do, under the circumstances? So here it is, all these school systems are basically trying to figure out what to do. And as a parent, you got to figure out as far as, unfortunately, most of us have aged out as far as having that, dynamic. But that'll be a key problem as far as from our household. What are we going to do?
You're talking about a triple whammy on people of color and COVID, right? Because you have more people in essential work jobs, you have worse health outcomes and worse health care in general, and then the whole child care thing with New York City public schools closing again. It's a triple play. Yeah. So I mean, you could attack that from any which way, except we can't ask Marty to appear on yet another panel about COVID.
The only thing you got to do is as far as
remember, I lived COVID, so when this is done, I'm going to go see a very sick man with COVID and turn some things around. So that's kind of what I've been doing. But I feel comfortable doing it. I've been doing it for a while now. So.
It's not past tense. Tell them.
Well,
It's not past tense, and that's what people don't realize, that people are still coming in sick with this. And people think it's.
Well, I work in the public school system, and we've already had cases pop up, and we've been open 2 days in the Boston area.
So would you get on an airplane, Marty? Because I haven't seen my kids in 7 months. They both live on the West Coast. I'm dying.
Driving.
I have
obviously never been in a car with me. I think Chuckles has.
Can I jump in here with a question? It's Quentin. Sure. Hey, it kind of relates to today's topic, but I'm curious now that your generation and your children are where you are located, but those relatives of yours, your nieces and nephews, and perhaps some of your grandchildren, their kids. How have your kids kept in touch with their cousins back home? And of course, during the COVID time, there may be some folks who are living in areas, perhaps red states or certain pockets where the COVID is really impinging on them in a direct way, compared to where your own accomplishments in life have probably left you in maybe safer environments. So I'm curious about, do you have distant family that you're in touch with, and how they're doing? And that kind of connection. Yeah. Thank you.
I'm laughing because
I don't know how. It's a good question. We've had worries about some of my mother's family in New Bern. Like she has a cousin who's probably about her age. And we've had some trouble getting in touch with her, and so we're literally not sure what's going on with her. But the reality is that in terms of the next generation of cousins, meaning these were my mother's first cousins, and so their children, I guess, and my mother's children, we're now what is it, second cousins. And we really don't actually keep in touch much. I don't, you know, I don't know my second cousins very well. I do have one who's who married a Williams gal, Reginald Sanders, who went to Yale Med School with Beth Ann Moore, who was in the class of '81. But he's really the only one that I've been able to kind of like follow or know much about. So, so that is an interesting question you raised, because I guess it does sort of lead to the, you know, the topic of once you start getting into second cousins and first cousins once removed and all that kind of thing, how much of the connection is still there, you know, in the context of migration. And I think
I think that the reunions keep some of the families intact. So the family reunions, and with that, we've brought together, you know, multiple generations. And so that's worked out well. And then unfortunately funerals, so that will also bring the cousins together. As far as keep them together after that, it's a little bit more difficult, but we've had some informal cousins gatherings, but because of the way families are, I wasn't invited to them, but at least as far as other family members, they were kind of keeping together.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, it's interesting, Quentin, I was laughing because when you're saying concerning as far as particularly this time, it gets to be a generational technological divide too, because my father's back home in Augusta. No matter how many times I've tried and other people have tried to get him to use the internet and other things, sorry, it just doesn't compute. And so basically it's by telephone. And as far as for my older members of the family, no, it's keeping up by telephone as far as calling them. But for the younger ones, as far as for my children, everyone, that technology is part of their DNA. So they're able to communicate, contact, talk, you know, interact as far as with one another in more ways than actually that I know as far as to do. But that is the one aspect that I indicated, and actually it was interesting talking with Kate about this, because, you know, talking with Kate, how her mother is within the same vicinity, but due to COVID concerns, they don't necessarily interact or saw each other as much at the beginning. And I indicated that if that was the case, you know, particularly with my father and some other, I don't know how I would take the matter, but now it's still a matter of trying to figure out as far as to go back home and visit. And let's just say, similar to what Marty was indicating, that actually, even though it will take me longer, I think the safer course of journey is to actually drive back home, which is about 16 hours or so if I go straight, as far as rather than taking the airplane, as far as down there. But it's something that I am legitimately considering as far as what to do, as far as just to visit family back home and just see. But again, even back in Georgia, even though Augusta is basically a big medical center for the state of Georgia, there's medical school and a number of learning centers as far as for there. So relatively speaking, they've been in good shape as far as Augusta. Atlanta's been more of a problem, and again, it's more density. So let's just say I do have a comfort zone as far as my family in Augusta. And actually, I have to say, of all places that I've known people unfortunately died, passed away, is very few people back home. And let's just say there's a whole lot more people that I know here in the New York area who unfortunately have expired as far as doing this COVID situation.
Kate, you're on mute.
Sorry. Guys, I have to hop off, but thank you. And by the way, Chuckleton, my mother actually does email. She's 96, and every one of her emails looks like a hostage note because she gets stuck on cap lock. So listen, Kate, why haven't you called me? Anyway, I have to go, but great to see you guys, and thank you all so much.
Okay, I gotta hop up too.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Next time. Bye.
Yeah.